Tonight we will drift through different kinds of darkness in our solar system, not to study it, but to soften into its rhythm like a quiet current carrying you. Darkness is not only the absence of light, it is the space where the nervous system can stop scanning for danger. Some places are dark because the sun is too far away. Some are dark because clouds are too thick to let clarity through. And some are dark because time itself stretches slow and unhurried. There is no need to rush. Breath settles on its own when nothing is being chased. Thoughts can step aside the way a room changes when the lights are turned off. You do not lose yourself in that shift. You simply stop fighting for sharp edges. Now the space around you begins to widen. A distant point of light grows smaller, not because it is leaving, but because you are no longer holding it tightly. The dark does not swallow you. It smooths what is loud. It lowers the contrast. It lets the mind rest its grip. Planet nights are a kind of clock. Each world keeps time with its own shadows. Some darkness arrives like a season. Some stays like a hidden pocket that sunlight never reaches. Each one teaches the same lesson in a different language. You can be safe without being bright. Here is the route for our journey, chosen to feel new first, then familiar later. We begin far out at Neptune, where sunlight is only a faint whisper. From there we move to Uranus, where darkness can last like a long season. And at the end, we approach a final presence that we do not see directly, only feel through gravity, like a calm weight shaping distant paths. For now, we start with Neptune. Imagine a blue edge of night, cold and gentle, with storms moving silently under a dim sky. And as you drift toward it, let one question remain softly open. If darkness is not your enemy, what might it be protecting inside you? If light becomes a fine dust, the night can feel strangely thick. Not heavy, not threatening, just closer, like a quiet fabric settling. At Neptune, darkness has a temperature in the imagination, a cold rim of blue. That blue is not brightness. Distance gives it color and silence gives it weight. Far away, the sun still exists, yet it no longer feels like a command. A small pin of light holds its place in the black, gentle and remote. Neptune sits about 30 times farther from the sun than Earth does. Because of that, sunlight falls to roughly 1 part in 900. The scene is not flooded. Edges do not shout. Nothing insists on being perfectly defined. In this dim world, night is not empty. Motion continues without asking to be witnessed. Ice clouds drift, fold, and loosen again. Storm systems turn with a patience that feels almost ceremonial. Instead of a sky that ends, the darkness resembles an ocean that keeps moving in layers. Here comes the paradox. People fear darkness as a whole, as if it must pull you down. Yet in a place like this, darkness can feel like purity. Less information, fewer demands. When light is strong, the mind tries to label everything, to prove everything, to finish every thought. With light this faint, the mind has less to grab. The urge to invent explanations softens. What remains is simple presence, clean and unforced. Seeing becomes less important than sensing. A planet can be real without being crisp. Weather can be true without being detailed. Even your attention can be honest without being sharp. Notice how restful that is. No need to chase clarity. No need to tighten around meaning. The dark does not ask for performance. It offers a pause where the imagination can stop filling every gap with noise. And still, something inside Neptune stays intensely alive. Despite the weak sunlight, the planet keeps its restless energy. Storms keep their rhythm. The atmosphere keeps rearranging itself quietly, insistently, as if movement is its natural language. Let a question float here like a distant signal, steady and unanswered. If the light is this faint, what keeps moving so strongly? No solution is required. A soft curiosity is enough. You can rest beside the question the way you might rest beside a window at night, listening without searching. Soon the cold blue rim will begin to thin. Neptune will fall behind, not as a loss, but as a gentle change in texture. From there, you will drift onward, and time itself will start to shift its rhythm. Not one evening, not one stretch of sleep, but a span of darkness large enough to reshape the idea of time. Uranus arrives with a horizon that refuses to sit straight. A tilted line cuts across the world, calm and slightly unreal. Light behaves like a traveler with no interest in climbing. It moves sideways, sliding along the edge instead of rising, as if dawn forgot the direction it usually takes. This is the scale shift. Night is not a moment here. It becomes a season. It becomes an entry in a calendar written into the planet. Uranus rotates with an extreme tilt, almost lying on its side as it circles the sun. That single orientation turns ordinary day and night into something far less familiar. On Earth, darkness arrives, retreats, and returns with dependable rhythm. Here, the rhythm stretches until it stops feeling like a beat and starts feeling like landscape. Near the polar regions, the consequence becomes almost unimaginable. A long period of light can hold on for years. Then, when the pole turns away, darkness can stay for decades. Not hours, not days, but a length of night that could contain a whole phase of life. The dark is no longer a short pause between bright chapters. It is the chapter. That is the paradox. Most people translate night as rest, a tidy ending, a gentle closing, a signal to recover. Yet on Uranus, night can expand into an era too wide to be treated as a simple break. Calling it rest feels too small, the way calling an ocean a puddle would feel too small. Still, something soft begins to happen when you hold that scale without resisting it. Short nights invite bargaining. The mind checks time, counts minutes, measures what is left, and tries to force recovery into a narrow window. A season of darkness removes the negotiation. The clock becomes less persuasive. Urgency loses its voice. Picture that slanted horizon again. A pale band of light travels along it, steady and horizontal. No dramatic sunrise, no quick victory of morning. Just a quiet line moving as if it has all the time in the universe. The rest of the world remains in a deep, patient dimness, not empty, just unclaimed by brightness. In that environment, the inner world has to adapt. Attention cannot keep sprinting toward the next change because the next change is far away. Thought cannot stay sharp forever because sharpness needs frequent reward. What remains is a slower intelligence, the ability to loosen without certainty, the ability to settle without being promised a quick return of light. Darkness here feels like a schedule rather than an event. A schedule does not demand constant emotion. A schedule simply exists, steady and impersonal. That steadiness can be soothing even when it is strange. Nothing is rushing you. Nothing is counting your performance. If a night lasted for decades, what would you stop forcing? Which worries would lose their power when they cannot threaten the next hour? What stories would fade when they no longer get a daily stage? Let the curiosity stay gentle and open. When night becomes a season, how does the mind learn to let go? Does it soften because there is no deadline, or does it resist because it cannot control the scale? No answer is required. A quiet noticing is enough. The tilted horizon can hold you without asking you to understand it. That sideways light can pass without needing to be named. Soon we move again. The dim band thins. Space feels a little lighter, as if the dark itself has loosened its grip. Then the glow shifts, unexpectedly warming as you drift inward. Light grows thinner, and then without warning, it turns hot. Mercury is the closest planet to the Sun, and still, darkness can keep ice. That contradiction is not a trick, and it is not a lesson to force. It is a quiet doorway into a different kind of night, where distance is not the only reason darkness exists. A polar crater opens like a bowl cut into stone, simple and ancient, with a rim bright enough to feel sharp. Along that rim, sunlight can be almost merciless, clean and direct, because Mercury has nearly no atmosphere to soften it. Down on the crater floor, the story changes completely, not with drama, but with geometry. Walls rise at just the right angles. The sun stays low in the sky, and the bottom can remain untouched by direct light. Here, the first fact is about time, and time on Mercury moves in a slow, unfamiliar way. A solar day on this planet lasts a very long time. So light does not hurry across the surface the way it does on Earth. Shadows stretch and linger, and the change from day to night is not a quick turn of a clock. It is a long passage, as if the planet is learning patience with every rotation. The second fact is about contrast, because Mercury holds extremes without apology. With little atmosphere to carry heat around, sunlight can turn exposed ground intensely hot, while darkness can drop into deep cold. The difference is not subtle, and it does not feel like a gentle evening cooling. It feels like two climates placed side by side, separated by a boundary that stays crisp and hard. Then the third fact arrives, and it is the one that makes the paradox real. Near the poles, some crater floors receive almost no direct sunlight at all, not because the sun is absent, but because the angle never favors the bottom. Those shadows are not the ordinary kind that slide away with morning because morning does not reach them. In those permanently shadowed places, ice can survive, preserved by darkness in a world that otherwise lives close to fire. This is the paradox, stated simply. The nearer a planet is to the sun, the more exact its shadows can become, and the more fiercely some regions can be denied light. Brightness does not erase darkness here. Instead, it sharpens the boundary, and the boundary creates pockets where night becomes a permanent condition. Something soft can happen when you stay with that image without trying to control it. The mind tends to treat light as safety and darkness as danger, and it builds that habit early and repeats it for years. Mercury breaks the habit with one quiet example. Darkness can be shelter, and shadow can be a vault. Less information does not always mean more fear, because less information can also mean fewer demands. Picture the crater again, but keep the scene slow and spacious. A rim of stone holds the glare like a thin, bright line, while the interior remains still, cool, and unclaimed by heat. That interior does not feel like a pit pulling you down. It feels like a sealed room, protected from noise, where nothing insists on being explained. Even the surface outside the crater teaches something about the nervous system. Under harsh sunlight, everything becomes defined, edges sharpen, and the mind wants to name what it sees. In shadow, the urge to label begins to loosen because the world offers fewer details to chase. A quiet clarity emerges, not the clarity of high definition, but the clarity of not needing to invent a story. Now let one question drift in, steady and unforced. What is darkness hiding right next to fire? Not as a mystery to solve, but as a feeling to notice, because the question changes your pace when you let it. Some answers are not made of words, and Mercury does not ask for words. It offers an image instead, ice held in shadow, on the brightest side of the inner solar system intact, because light cannot reach it. That image can be enough, the way a single calm scene can be enough to quiet the mind without any explanation. When you are ready to move on, keep only the boundary in memory, bright rim, silent hollow, darkness as protection. The bare rock begins to fall behind, and the scene starts to thicken in your imagination. Ahead waits a world with a heavy sky, where darkness is not stored in craters but spread through clouds. You leave the exposed stone, and a denser atmosphere gathers in front of you. Venus invites that question quietly, because the planet is bright from the outside, yet strangely dim once you imagine yourself beneath its clouds. From far away, Venus can look like a polished lantern in the sky, almost too luminous to be real, because its upper cloud layers reflect sunlight so strongly. That is the myth, a world of light, a world that should feel warm and clear simply because it shines so much. The reality is softer and more disorienting, because the brightness is mostly a surface effect and the experience underneath becomes something closer to an endless twilight. Hold the anchor image gently, a thick ceiling of cloud, a muted yellow glow, and a landscape that refuses to cast a clean shadow. The light is present, yet it is not directional, as if it has been rubbed into the air rather than delivered from a single point. Instead of sharp contrast, everything becomes diffuse, and the eye loses the usual clues that say where the sun is, where forward is, and where time is moving. This is the first fact, softened into experience. Venus is wrapped in extremely dense clouds that reflect a great deal of sunlight back into space, which is why the planet appears so bright from the outside. Beneath that reflective layer, the light that remains is scattered and weakened, so the world can feel dim, even when the sky above is blazing with reflected brightness. The paradox begins here, simple and unsettling. The sky can be bright and still. The lived experience can feel dark. The second fact changes the rhythm, because Venus does not treat time the way we do. The planet rotates very slowly, and that slow rotation stretches the cycle of day and night until it becomes difficult to imagine with an earth-trained mind. Instead of a familiar pattern that resets every 24 hours, the sense of day can feel drawn out, and the sense of night can feel drawn out, as if time itself has been pulled thin like warm glass. When a cycle is that long, The mind cannot rely on quick changes to anchor emotion because the clock is no longer a comforting metronome. Then the third fact arrives as a feeling of orientation, or rather, the loss of it. Because the light is heavily scattered by clouds, it becomes harder to identify a clear direction, and shadows lose their sharpness or disappear into a soft blur. On Earth, a shadow is one of the simplest ways to locate yourself because it is an honest pointer. It tells you where the light is coming from. On Venus, that pointer fades, and with it, a small part of certainty fades too, leaving you with a gentler, stranger kind of awareness. This is where the myth versus reality becomes useful, not as a correction, but as a release. The mind likes to believe that brightness equals clarity, that light equals control, that seeing well means being safe. Venus quietly disagrees because its brightness does not translate into crispness and its light does not translate into direction. A bright planet can still hold a dim inner experience, and that is the core paradox. A place can be bright in the sky while still feeling dark where it is lived. Notice how that paradox can calm the mind in a subtle way. If light does not guarantee certainty, then the mind can stop demanding certainty as the price of safety. If shadows are not required for orientation, then the mind can relax its habit of constant measurement. The absence of clear shadows becomes a kind of permission because there is less to track, less to judge, and less to hold in place. Imagine standing in that muted glow where the air feels thick with scattered light and where the world has no sharp edges to insist on attention. The horizon does not offer a clean division between day and night because the sky above is more like a veil than a window. Even the idea of noon loses its authority because the brightness does not peak in a way you can easily recognize. Everything becomes twilight-like, and twilight is the hour when the nervous system often begins to soften because it senses the end of effort, even if effort is not required. Now let the curiosity loop open, steady, and quiet. When you cannot rely on a clear shadow to tell you where you are, what becomes your compass? Do you follow direction or do you follow feeling? Do you locate yourself by certainty or by the simple fact that you are still here, still breathing, still carried by time? Venus offers a strange kind of rest, not because it is gentle in the usual sense, but because its light is non-demanding. The glow does not point and command. It surrounds. It fills. It makes the world less about targets and more about atmosphere, and the mind can begin to match that atmosphere without trying to force a conclusion. As you drift away from Venus, keep only one thing with you. Brightness in the sky does not always become brightness in experience. That thought is not meant to confuse you, but to loosen the grip of simple equations so your mind can stop working so hard to be sure. The yellow haze thins in the distance, and a different kind of shadow begins to form ahead. A new shape appears, not made by clouds, but by geometry and motion. Another darkness arrives, and this time it is the shadow of rings. Saturn offers that kind of quiet impossibility, not as a spectacle that demands attention, but as a slow note written across its own sky. The first impression is not the planet itself, but the way space around it seems arranged, as if someone placed delicate lines into darkness and then let them drift. A pale world sits inside a system of rings, and those rings behave like a structure made of light and absence at the same time. Hold the anchor image carefully, a thin band of darkness sweeping across soft clouds like a curtain moving at an unhurried pace. Field notes softly spoken. Above the atmosphere, the rings turn, wide and patient, and their shadow is not a stain. It is a shape. It arrives with geometry, and it leaves with geometry, and the movement feels less like weather and more like choreography. The first fact appears as a simple relationship between objects. Saturn's rings cast shadows onto the planet's atmosphere, and those shadows shift with the seasons. Because Saturn travels around the Sun on a long orbit, the angle of sunlight changes gradually, and the shadow of the rings slides across the cloud tops in slow, deliberate arcs. What looks like a still image from far away becomes a living pattern when you imagine time moving, because the shadow is always adjusting to a changing tilt and a changing position in space. The second fact is about rhythm, and Saturn's rhythm is not quick. Its seasons are long, and they unfold with the patience of a planet that is not trying to impress anyone. That length gives the ring shadow cyclical character, almost like a calendar written in darkness, returning in familiar ways, while never arriving in exactly the same place twice. A band of shadow can become a seasonal marker, a quiet reminder that time exists even when nothing feels urgent. Then the third fact shows why this darkness feels different from the darkness you have met so far. The shadow looks beautiful because it has geometry. It is not a random dimming, and it is not an accident of distance or cloud. It is a line, a curve, a careful slice of night, drawn by the rings themselves, as if darkness is being used as a design element in the planet's sky. Here the paradox becomes gentle and clear. Most fears of darkness come from the idea of loss, the idea that something has been taken away. Saturn suggests another possibility. Darkness can be an elegant structure, a precise arrangement, a kind of visual intelligence. The shadow is not a failure of light. It is an intentional boundary created by the architecture of the rings, and that boundary can feel strangely comforting because it is coherent. Stay with the curtain image for a moment, letting it move slowly across the atmosphere. The clouds below are soft and layered, and the band of shadow makes them seem even softer, as if contrast has been reduced on purpose. When the mind watches a pattern that is orderly, it often begins to settle because it no longer needs to scan for surprises. A predictable curve can quiet the part of you that expects chaos. That quieting opens the curiosity loop in a calm way. If a shadow can be this beautiful, what are you really afraid of when you fear darkness? Is it the absence of light, or is it the absence of control? Is it the lack of information, or is it the feeling that you might have to face yourself without distraction? Saturn does not answer. It simply keeps moving. The rings keep turning. The shadow keeps sliding, and the planet keeps its slow seasonal breathing, as if time is an ocean and this is one of its tides. Let your attention rest on one detail and allow everything else to soften around it. A thin band of dark passes, not heavy, not urgent, just present, like a quiet hand passing over a page. The mind can follow it without effort, and in following it, the mind becomes slower too. Soon we leave the elegance of the rings behind and move into a different scale. The curtain-like shadow fades, and the scene begins to deepen, as if you are entering the body of something immense. The next darkness will not arrive from above as a pattern on clouds. It will come from within a giant world where night is not brought by an external sky, but by depth itself. You drift inward and the sense of outside begins to dissolve. You arrive at Jupiter as if stepping into a night walk that has no street, no ground, and no clear edge. A vast ceiling of clouds stretches in every direction, layered and heavy, with textures that feel like slow-moving fabric rather than weather. Far inside that thickness, an occasional lightning flash appears for a moment, distant and quiet, and then the dark closes again, as if nothing happened. The first thing to notice is that Jupiter does not offer a solid surface in the way the mind expects a planet to do. To go in is not to walk onto land, because there is no simple boundary that says, here is the ground, here is the sky. Entering Jupiter means entering layers, one after another, like descending through curtains of gas that become denser as you move deeper. This is the first fact. Softened into a feeling, Jupiter is a giant planet without a clearly defined solid surface, so the idea of depth replaces the idea of place. As the walk continues, darkness changes its meaning. On the worlds we've visited so far, darkness came from distance, from angle, from cloud cover, or from geometry. On Jupiter, darkness comes from thickness because light cannot travel forever through dense layers. The deeper you imagine yourself drifting, the more the light fades, not as a sudden loss, but as a gradual surrender. This is the second fact, again translated into experience. Sunlight does not penetrate far into the deeper layers, and darkness increases with depth, becoming more complete the farther you go. There is a particular calm in that gradient. A gradual dimming does not shock the nervous system the way an abrupt blackout can. Instead, it teaches the mind to let go in stages because each layer takes a little more detail away. Edges soften first, then colors thin. Then the urge to track everything loosens until what remains is simply presence inside a thick, quiet world. Now bring the anchor image back. Dense clouds and a rare lightning flash far away. That flash is the third fact, and it changes the texture of darkness without breaking it. Lightning creates brief moments of illumination, tiny and temporary compared to the size of the planet, and those moments make the darkness feel more real rather than less. A single pulse of light does not defeat the night here. It reveals it the way a short breath of air can make you aware of the room you are in. The paradox becomes clear when you hold it beside your memory of Earth. From our sky, Jupiter can appear bright and commanding, a shining presence in the night, easy to find among the stars. Yet inside Jupiter there is a night so thick that light cannot keep its authority, and the world becomes increasingly dark as you go inward. A planet that looks luminous from far away can hide a deeper darkness within, and that hidden darkness is not a mistake. It is a natural consequence of depth. During this night walk, the mind is invited to change what it expects from seeing. Vision is useful near the outer layers, where light still carries information. Deeper down, sensation becomes more honest than sight, because the environment is not offering sharp images anymore. The mind can stop trying to extract detail, and it can start noticing quieter signals. the sense of pressure, the sense of slow motion, the sense of being held inside a vast atmosphere that does not need your interpretation. Then the curiosity loop opens, and it opens softly. Why would a small lightning flash make you feel calm? Perhaps because it proves the world is alive, even when it is dark. Perhaps because a brief glow gives you permission to stop searching, since it shows that light can appear without you forcing it. Perhaps the flash feels reassuring because it is not constant, because it does not demand attention, and because it fades quickly enough to let the darkness remain gentle. A lightning flash can also make the mind trust the dark, because it demonstrates a balance. The dark is not empty and the light is not controlling. Both exist, and neither needs to dominate the other. That balance can be soothing, in a way that steady brightness is not, because steady brightness keeps the mind working, while a rare pulse of light allows the mind to relax between moments. Stay on the walk a little longer, letting the layers pass without naming them too precisely. The cloud tops feel like a ceiling, then like a hallway, then like a deeper interior, and each step inward becomes less about arriving somewhere and more about releasing the need to arrive. The occasional lightning pulse appears, distant and small, like a reminder that movement continues even when you do not see it. When you are ready to leave, the darkness does not snap off. It loosens gradually, as if you are drifting back toward thinner air. The huge mass of Jupiter begins to fall behind you, still alive, still deep, still holding its inner night without resistance. Ahead, another world waits, with a lighter sky, where the atmosphere feels less heavy and the edge between day and night becomes easier to recognize. You move away from the giant's depth and you drift toward a place with a thinner ceiling of air. On Mars, darkness does not arrive like a clean curtain falling at the end of a day. It gathers in the air itself, made from dust so fine that it can turn sunlight into a slow, muted hush. The anchor image is simple and steady, a pale red sky, light fading as if a thin veil has been drawn across the world. One question threads through everything here, and you can carry it gently without answering it. When the sky grows dim, is it night or is it the day becoming soft and uncertain? Mars does not rush to define the difference because its darkness can be manufactured by weather rather than time. The first fact appears as a long dimming that can last, not as a moment, but as a condition. Dust storms on Mars can grow large and persistent, filling the atmosphere with suspended particles that block and scatter sunlight. Under that haze, the sky can remain darkened and blurred for extended periods, as if daylight has been diluted rather than removed. The world becomes quieter in appearance, with fewer sharp edges, fewer contrasts, and fewer demands on attention. That quieting can feel calming, even if the cause is dramatic, because the effect is a softened field of vision. Sharp detail fades, and with it a subtle kind of mental tension can fade too, since the mind has less to track and less to interpret. It becomes easier to accept the scene as it is, because the scene is no longer insisting on precision. The second fact is a strange, gentle beauty that lives at the edge of evening. Mars sunsets can show a bluish tint near the sun, a cooler color threaded through a warm sky, because the dust scatters light in a way that changes what reaches your eyes. Instead of a simple red to black transition, twilight can hold a surprising gradient where color becomes a quiet signal rather than a loud announcement. This is where the paradox begins to reveal itself. Darkness is not always black, and sometimes the color it carries makes it feel even softer. A dim sky with color can soothe the mind differently than pure darkness does. Blackness can feel absolute, and the mind often reacts by searching harder for certainty. A colored dimness feels like an in-between state, and the in-between can be kinder because it does not demand a verdict. Mars offers that in-between as a familiar atmosphere, a veil rather than a void. The third fact is brief and almost delicate, like a small punctuation mark in a long sentence. Mars has small moons, and their shadows can cross the planet quickly. A tiny moving blot that lasts only a short time. That passing shadow is not the main darkness of Mars, yet it reminds you that darkness can be mobile, precise, and momentary, even inside a broader haze. A single fleeting shadow can add depth to the scene because it shows that dimness is not only a blanket, but also a set of moving relationships. Now the one question becomes more personal, and you can let it stay open without pressure. If darkness has shades, does your emotion change with the shade? Does a red dimness feel warmer, more forgiving, more human? Does a bluish edge at sunset feel like relief because it suggests coolness inside heat? Does a momentary shadow feel reassuring because it proves time is still moving even when the day feels stalled? Mars teaches a quiet lesson about perception. You do not always need the world to become fully dark in order to feel the nervous system unwind. Sometimes the mind relaxes when the world becomes less precise, when the air itself reduces contrast and turns sharpness into softness. Dust does not erase the day. It filters it, and that filtering changes the internal tone. Hold the pale red sky again and let the light fade as if through fabric. Nothing in this scene needs to be solved. A gentle dimness can be enough to carry you because it provides a middle ground between effort and surrender. If your mind wants to label it as night, it can. If your mind wants to label it as day softened by weather, it can. The label does not matter as much as the feeling of release. In a moment, we will drift away from Mars, leaving behind this dust-made twilight. The next stop will feel familiar in name, yet the darkness there will not feel natural at all because it will be interrupted by what we build and what we leave on. You turn back toward the world you know, and you return to a place where night has been pierced, altered, and reshaped by artificial light. Earth appears, and the darkness changes its meaning again, because this time the night is not only made by physics, it is edited by us, punctured by our choices, and stitched with a quiet insistence that the dark should never be complete. The anchor image holds steady at a distance, a mesh of city lights spread across the surface like artificial stars mapped onto the planet. From space, that glow can look beautiful, almost tender, as if humanity left a constellation on the ground. Up close, the same glow becomes a different kind of weather because it alters the night itself. Light spills upward, scatters through the atmosphere, and turns the sky brighter than it used to be until darkness begins to feel like something rare rather than something normal. The first fact is simple and consequential. Light pollution brightens the night sky and washes out the stars. When scattered artificial light fills the air, the Milky Way becomes harder to see, and the sense of a deep, layered universe fades behind a pale dome. A sky that once carried countless points of light can become a flat ceiling, and the mind loses one of its oldest cues for scale and quiet. That loss matters in a subtle way because darkness is not only about what you see. Darkness is also about what your nervous system is allowed to stop doing. A brighter night can keep the brain in a slightly more alert mode because the environment never fully signals that the day is finished. The body does not receive a clean invitation to slow down, and even when sleep arrives, it can feel thinner, as if the night was not fully granted. The second fact shifts the scene away from cities and back towards the planet's natural extremes. At the poles, Earth can hold long periods of darkness tied to seasons, and those long nights are not just a visual condition. They behave like a biological rhythm, giving the nervous system an extended environment of dimness that can deepen the sense of rest and reduce the demand for constant scanning. Seasonal night in those regions can feel like a slower heartbeat, where time is measured in weeks and months rather than hours. Between the city mesh and the polar night, a contrast emerges that is easy to overlook. Earth still knows how to be truly dark, but much of our daily experience has moved away from that original state. Night has not disappeared, yet it has been modified, made thinner, and filled with a faint glow that keeps the mind half awake. The third fact arrives as a reminder that darkness can be more precise than our feelings about it. A solar eclipse shows darkness as geometry and alignment, a measurable shadow crossing the world with timing that can be predicted and mapped. For a moment, daytime can dim in a way that feels impossible, not because the world is broken, but because the celestial mechanics are exact. That precision is important because it reveals that darkness can be an event with structure, not merely an emotion that happens inside you. Now the paradox lands, and it lands with a quiet sharpness. We fear darkness, and then we build a world that prevents true night from existing. We keep lights on for safety, for work, for convenience, for comfort, and those reasons can be real. At the same time, the cost is also real because a perforated night becomes a different psychological environment, one that never fully releases you from the expectation to stay available. This is the reality check, offered without blame and without softness, that pretends everything is fine. If the night is always bright, the mind never fully stands down. If the sky never becomes deep, the inner world is less likely to become deep. And if darkness is always avoided, the part of you that needs darkness to speak may never be heard. That is where the curiosity loop opens, and it is not a comfortable question even when it is asked gently. Are you avoiding darkness itself, or are you avoiding what darkness forces you to hear? Silence can be honest. Dimness can be honest. When external light fades, internal noise becomes more audible, and the mind may resist that exposure. Earth gives you a choice that other planets do not. You can turn night into day with a switch, and you can also choose to let the dark return, at least in small pockets. A darker room, a screen dimmed, a moment without the constant glow of devices, a quiet walk where the sky has a chance to be itself. Those choices are not romantic. They are practical signals to the nervous system that it is safe to release control. Hold the mesh of lights one more time, but let it be seen clearly for what it is. beauty, and interruption at once. Artificial stars can look like a gift, and they can also be a barrier between you and the deeper night that your body still recognizes. The planet beneath the glow is still capable of darkness, and the mind beneath your habits is still capable of listening. In a moment, you will leave the noise of the lights behind. The city mesh will thin and the air will feel colder and cleaner in your imagination. Ahead lies the edge, far and quiet, where distance itself becomes the main ingredient again. You drift away from the bright grid of Earth and you move toward the colder, farther dark at the rim. Pluto does not feel like a destination that you arrive at quickly because the journey itself becomes part of the darkness. Distance is the first ingredient here, and it changes the mind long before the world appears, until you begin to sense a slower tempo, as if time has widened. The anchor image is quiet and sparse, a small light, a deep sky, and movement that feels unhurried, almost ceremonial. Out here, the sun is no longer a commanding presence. It is closer to a bright star than a warm source, a point of light that does not fill the scene so much as mark it. That shift in scale matters because it alters the emotional contract between the mind and the environment. When the sun is strong, the mind expects clarity. When the sun becomes small, the mind learns a different expectation. Darkness is normal, and brightness is the accent. The first fact arrives with a soft, numerical edge, and it does not need to be repeated again. Pluto is so far from the sun that the sunlight it receives is only around a little over 1,000th of what Earth gets, approximately. That faintness does not simply make the world dim. It changes what day means, because daylight becomes less like a flood and more like a faint wash. In such a setting, the eyes would not search for sharp contrast, and the mind would not demand it either, because the environment is not offering crispness as a default. A deep sky is not only a visual experience, it is also a psychological one. When darkness becomes the background, the nervous system can stop treating it as an event, and the mind can stop treating it as a problem. What used to feel like a threat becomes a familiar context, and familiarity is one of the simplest paths to calm. The second fact is about the length of Pluto's orbit, which stretches the idea of seasons into something closer to chapters than days. Pluto takes a very long time to circle the sun, and as a result, its seasonal changes unfold slowly, as if the planet is turning pages at a pace that ignores human urgency. The mind often relaxes when it senses long continuity, because long continuity makes sudden shocks feel less likely, and it reduces the impulse to brace for quick change. That chapter-like feeling carries into the way you imagine light and dark on the surface. Instead of short cycles that constantly reset, the world feels like it is living inside a larger narrative. A season does not need to prove itself every day. A season simply holds its character, and then, eventually, it shifts. The third fact adds a delicate kind of instability, not the loud kind, but the kind that makes Pluto feel alive. Pluto's atmosphere is thin and can vary as its distance from the sun changes, which influences how the air behaves and how the night is experienced. In some conditions, the atmosphere can be more present. In others, it can diminish, and the character of night can feel as if it comes and goes with distance. That variability gives Pluto a sense of breathing, slow and faint, as if even at the edge of the solar system there is still a subtle exchange between light and world. Now the paradox becomes almost comforting when you let it settle. Very far from the sun, darkness stops being something that arrives, because it is already there as the default setting. Fear often depends on surprise, and surprise depends on contrast. When contrast is reduced and darkness is constant, the mind has less reason to react, because there is no sudden loss to interpret as danger. Darkness becomes background, and backgrounds rarely frighten you once you accept them. This is the scale shift that Pluto offers. Night is not an interruption, it is the canvas. If that canvas is always present, then the mind can become selective, noticing small details with gentle appreciation, instead of scanning the whole scene for threats. That is where the curiosity loop opens, and it opens in a calm, steady way. When darkness is the background, what becomes the highlight? Is it a small point of light that suddenly feels precious? Is it a change in texture across the surface that would be lost under stronger illumination? Is it the feeling of time itself, slowed enough that you can rest inside it? Pluto invites you to value subtlety, because subtlety is what remains when brightness is scarce. A small glow becomes meaningful without being loud. A slow change becomes reassuring without needing to entertain you. The mind can begin to trust quietness because quietness is no longer temporary. Stay with the small sun for a moment, not as a distant object, but as a feeling of scale. A faint light is still light, and it does not need to be strong to be real. In the presence of faintness, effort can soften because there is nothing to compete with. There is no bright day to chase, and there is no dramatic night to fear, because the scene is already settled into a deep tone. In a moment, we will go farther still, past what has been directly seen and visited. Pluto will recede into the deep sky, and the familiar edges of our solar system will begin to blur. Then the journey becomes even more quiet because the next place is not one we've touched with our eyes in the same way. And then we move toward a world no one has met by sight. If a planet is known through gravity rather than light, what are you really seeing? Not with your eyes, but with your sense for influence, for pattern, for the way a system quietly adjusts around something it cannot name. This last stop is not a landing, it is a threshold. There is no confirmed photograph to hold, like a postcard. There is only a wide quiet, and within that quiet a small irregularity in the rhythm of distant paths, as if the solar system is carrying a secret weight. Planet 9 is a hypothesis, not a settled world. The idea points to something far out, very cold and deeply dim, distant enough that sunlight would be faint and easily lost. What matters here is not certainty, but the shape of the question that certainty leaves behind, because the mind can learn to rest beside a question without turning it into a problem. The evidence, if it exists, would not arrive as a bright dot in a telescope image. It would arrive as an effect, a subtle persuasion, written into motion the way small bodies seem to gather, tilt, or align, as if following a pull they cannot explain. A presence can be suggested by its consequences, and the universe often speaks through consequences more than through direct display. That is the paradox, held gently. Something can be real, even when light has not delivered it to your senses. The mind usually trusts what it can see because seeing feels like control. Yet gravity does not care about your need for control. It shapes paths in silence, and it leaves hints that are easy to miss. if you only believe in what shines. So the darkness around Planet 9 is not only physical, it is also epistemic. A darkness of not yet, a region where knowledge is incomplete and incompleteness is allowed to breathe. This kind of darkness can be soothing because it does not demand immediate clarity. It does not push you to finish the thought. It gives you space to stop forcing a conclusion. Hold the anchor image as simply as possible, a wide emptiness and a slight drift in the choreography of orbits. That drift is not loud. It does not plead for attention. It just exists, like a quiet, irregular beat in a long song, hinting that something unseen may be keeping time. If you let that idea settle, it changes your relationship with the unknown. The unknown stops being a threat and becomes a landscape, and landscapes do not need to be solved in order to be walked through. A mind that can accept unseen influence becomes less reactive, because it no longer spends energy trying to light up every corner. Now the curiosity loop can turn inward without becoming heavy. How many parts of you live in the same way? Present through effect, felt through pull, shaping decisions without having a clean name? How many instincts, griefs, or quiet wants move the trajectory of your life the way gravity moves a small body, gently, persistently, without announcing itself? You do not need to identify them tonight. You do not need to fix them tonight. The act of noticing that unseen forces exist is already enough to loosen the mind's grip, because it replaces panic with humility. And humility can be deeply calming. And when you are ready, let this threshold carry you farther. If a hidden planet can be sensed through the way it rearranges a system, then darkness in the wider universe becomes more than emptiness. It becomes the medium where structure hides, where mass gathers, where forces travel without light, and where vast regions can remain unseen while still shaping everything around them. From here, we leave the edges of the solar system, not by speed, but by scale. The familiar sun becomes a smaller lamp behind you. Ahead waits a larger night, where whole arms of a galaxy curve through space, and where darkness is not merely the absence of light, but the stage on which light is born. And in that widening dark, you can simply stay still, as if you are turning slowly with the universe, quiet, unhurried, and safe inside what you do not yet know. From that last threshold, you drift outward without needing a map, because a map would pretend there are borders where there are only gradients. Behind you, the solar system becomes a faint habit of warmth, then a smaller glow, then a memory of direction that no longer matters. Ahead, space does not behave like a destination. It behaves like a medium, wide and quiet, with the darkness so smooth, it almost feels like fabric, stretched without tension. A few distant points of light remain, sparse and steady, not close enough to form a pattern, yet present enough to remind you that motion continues. Field notes kept slow and gentle. Interstellar space is not an empty box, even when it looks that way to the eye. Matter is extremely thin here, yet it is still present, spread across the distance as gas and dust that rarely announces itself. The density is so low that nothing becomes a tempting word, and still, nothing is not accurate. Depth begins to change shape the moment nearby surfaces disappear from experience. On a planet, light bounces back from familiar boundaries, and the mind uses those returns to build a sense of distance and scale. Between stars, there is far less to reflect light back toward you in a way that feels like a room with walls. The result is not simply darkness, but a different kind of spatial feeling, where the idea of near and far becomes softer and less certain. That softness can be calming because it removes the demand to orient quickly. A sky without close landmarks does not invite constant measurement, and the nervous system can stop checking for immediate edges. Instead of reading the scene like a map, you begin to sense it like a field, open and continuous without sharp instructions. Another quiet truth lives here. The visible is only one language. Many structures in this region reveal themselves more clearly through radio, infrared, or X-rays than through ordinary sight. Signals travel through the dark. Like threads, you cannot see directly, and yet they carry information all the same, as if the universe is speaking in frequencies that do not need your eyes. The paradox settles in without drama. What looks empty can still be a background full of subtle traffic, a medium that carries whispers of interaction across distances too large to feel. Darkness is not the absence of everything. It is often the absence of the kind of evidence your senses are used to trusting. When the scene offers fewer markers, the mind tends to compensate. It starts to sketch edges, invent direction, and assign meaning, because meaning feels like a handrail. You can notice that impulse without judging it, and you can let it soften because this is a place where certainty is not required for safety. So a question can float through you, unforced and unfinished. How much does your mind build when it cannot anchor itself to clear reference points? And how quickly does it mistake invention for stability? You do not need to answer because noticing is enough. If an image forms, let it pass. If a label appears, let it dissolve. If a story tries to begin, let it fade back into the smooth dark that does not demand completion. Then change arrives, not as a new light, but as a thickening of shadow. Far ahead, a darker region begins to take shape, not because you have traveled farther in any simple sense, but because something is blocking the light that would normally pass through. The darkness becomes less like a background and more like an object, as if the void has learned to cast its own silhouette. A denser patch of dark gradually reveals itself, not from distance alone, but from light being stopped. The darker patch ahead does not behave like ordinary night, because it has an edge. Ink-like and slow, it spreads across the star field with a soft boundary, as though the sky has been stained rather than dimmed. Behind that stain, stars seem to vanish, not because they are gone, but because your line of sight has been quietly taken away. Myth speaks first because the mind loves a simple explanation. An empty gap appears, and the instinct is to call it a void, a place where nothing exists and nothing matters. Reality is less dramatic and more precise. The darkness is not a lack of content, but the presence of a screen. Dust in space is not dust in the ordinary sense, yet it behaves like a veil. Tiny particles absorb and scatter visible light. So starlight that would normally reach you becomes weakened, redirected, or erased from sight. A region can look blank while still being filled with material, simply because the light has been interrupted before it can deliver a picture. Infrared changes the story without breaking the calm. Longer wavelengths travel through dust more effectively, revealing structures that the eye would miss entirely. The same region that seems like a solid patch of night can unfold into filaments, gradients, and depth once you listen with a different kind of light. What looked like absence becomes texture, and texture becomes a hint that something has been there all along. Chemistry lives quietly inside that veil. Dust is not only a barrier, it is also a surface where molecules can form, gather, and evolve over time. In the cold and dim conditions within these clouds, the ingredients for more complex matter can begin to assemble. Patiently and without spectacle, a dark nebula can hide the early steps of creation while appearing to be nothing at all. Here the paradox becomes gentle and almost reassuring. Darkness can signal thickness, not emptiness, because a dense region is exactly what can stop light from passing cleanly. A place that looks like a hole in the sky may be closer to a wall than a gap, and walls can shelter as much as they conceal. Notice what that does to the way you interpret darkness. Instead of treating it as a missing scene, you can treat it as a covered scene, present but withheld. The nervous system often relaxes when a mystery feels contained, because contained mysteries do not threaten to spill everywhere. The curiosity loop opens on its own, quiet and steady. What richness might be hidden behind what your eyes label as empty? And how often does the mind confuse unseen with unreal? Now the motion continues without urgency. A slow drift carries you inward, deeper into the dusty region where the light becomes more filtered and the temperature becomes part of the narrative. Cold begins to define the rhythm, not as discomfort, but as a steady condition that changes how matter behaves and how time feels. You move further into the dust, and the chill starts to set the tempo for everything that follows. The dusty veil thins into something softer, and the darkness changes texture until it feels padded rather than flat. A molecular cloud holds that softness, thick as quiet cotton in the imagination, moving so slowly that motion becomes a suggestion instead of a spectacle. Along its edges, the boundary does not snap or cut. It dissolves into the deeper sky as if the universe prefers gradients to lines. Scale shifts here in a subtle way because the scene stops being about what blocks light and starts being about what prepares it. Cold becomes the main architect, not the kind of cold that shocks, but the kind that steadies chemistry and lets time do careful work. Molecular clouds are extremely cold, and that low temperature helps molecules persist, allowing material to accumulate over long spans without being quickly torn apart or dispersed. Within that darkness, density is not uniform. Certain regions grow thicker than their surroundings, and gravity begins to matter more than pressure, gently gathering matter toward shared centers. Nothing needs to rush for the gathering to be real, because a slow pull can reshape a cloud the way a long breath can reshape attention. Over time, the balance tilts, and the cloud's interior starts to hint at a future that is not visible yet. Before any clear source of light appears, the process resembles a long incubation. Surface signs remain minimal, dramatic markers stay absent, and the most important changes happen quietly, hidden behind a veil of cold and dust. The mind often expects beginnings to be bright, loud, or obvious, yet molecular clouds offer beginnings that are dim, patient, and almost deliberately understated. Here the paradox becomes both simple and calming. The darkest regions can be the ones that nurture future light for the longest time, as if Brightness needs a sheltered phase before it can arrive without burning itself out. Darkness is not acting as an enemy of creation in this place. It is acting as the condition that makes slow formation possible. A question rises naturally from that atmosphere, and it does not need to be solved to be useful. If growth requires a period of shadow, are you trying to leave too soon? Or are you learning to stay long enough for something real to form? A gentle patience can feel like doing nothing. Yet it can also be the most active choice a nervous system can make when it finally stops fighting time. As you drift deeper, the cloud's softness begins to hide an even quieter structure within it. Further inside, starless cores wait like compressed pauses, darker and more silent than the surrounding material, as though time has been folded inward and held there. In that deeper layer, preparation becomes almost indistinguishable from stillness, and the next stage begins without announcing itself. A starless core appears without announcing itself, like a darker pocket within an already dim cloud. Its outline never becomes sharp, and the edge stays blurred, as though the region prefers to be sensed rather than defined. Within that soft boundary, the scene feels hushed, not empty, and the silence carries a gentle weight. One question can accompany you here, quiet enough to not disturb the drift. How can something be forming even when nothing is shining yet? Density increases in these cores, slowly and steadily, while no internal light has turned on. Material gathers and settles into a shape that becomes more stable over time, the way a thought can become calmer once it stops being chased. From the outside, almost nothing changes, yet the interior grows more committed to its own center. Chemistry continues in the cold, and the cold does not feel harsh in imagination. Simple molecules can persist and combine along patient pathways, building a foundation that does not need to be visible to be real. Darkness becomes less like a curtain and more like a shelter, holding the process in a steady pace. Evidence arrives indirectly because the core does not offer brightness as proof. Absorption, traces, and subtle signatures hint at what is present, letting you sense structure without demanding a clear picture. In this place, knowing is softer than seeing, and softness is enough. A paradox settles gently. A process can be alive without needing to be witnessed. Growth does not require an audience to continue, and formation does not need applause to remain true. Silence can be the condition that keeps the shape intact long enough to matter. The curiosity loop turns inward with a light touch, like a hand resting on a surface rather than pressing. Is there a part of you that has been developing in the same quiet way, influencing your direction while still unnamed? No answer is required because noticing already loosens the need to force clarity. As you drift deeper, the core's hush begins to feel like a boundary you simply do not hurry. A different darkness waits beyond, not louder, just more final in its direction, like a line that only allows one-way travel. From this quiet preparation, you move toward a kind of night, defined by a point of no return. A black hole begins as a paradox, because what draws the eye is not the center, but the rim. A thin ring of light hangs in the dark like a quiet outline, while the middle remains deeply still, as if space has learned to pause there. Around that silent point, motion feels slower in the imagination, not forced, just gently restrained, as though everything chooses to move more carefully. Its presence is usually known through what it does rather than how it looks. Gravity shapes the paths nearby, and matter that drifts inward can gather into a bright, heated disk, glowing as it spirals and compresses. Light in this scene is not a lamp shining outward. It is a trace left behind by falling material, changing under pressure. The dark center is not simply an empty patch painted onto space. Light that would have passed through can be bent, redirected, or withheld, and the result is a shadow-like region that appears as a calm absence. A boundary is implied there, one way in feeling, where escape becomes harder to imagine than return. Other kinds of light carry the richer hints. Radio signals and X-rays often reveal the most active parts of these environments, showing heat, jets, and high-energy motion that the eye would never notice. The story becomes layered without becoming loud, as if different frequencies are whispering the same truth in different voices. Then the paradox settles into clarity. The darkest thing is sketched by light at the edge, like a fine line that makes silence visible. Instead of darkness erasing meaning, darkness becomes the background that allows the smallest brightness to matter. A question opens softly, with no pressure to answer. Why can a clear boundary, even a one-way one, make the mind relax its struggle? Limits can end the need to negotiate, and the end of negotiation can feel like rest. Let the ring remain delicate in your mind. A thin glow, a deep, still center, and a slow curve that holds everything without asking for effort. Nothing needs to be approached, and nothing needs to be solved, because the calm comes from simply allowing the shape to exist. As the drift continues, that bright rim recedes until it becomes a small mark against a larger dark. The circle fades behind you, and another kind of center begins to open ahead, not belonging to one object, but to an entire system moving together. Between galaxies, darkness is not a pause between scenes. Vast distance becomes the scene itself, wide and steady, with no close surfaces to return light to you. A few galaxies remain in view, like remote islands, small yet persistent, their glow thin enough to feel precious rather than commanding. Scale shifts quietly here, because the mind stops thinking in neighborhoods and begins thinking in oceans. The space between galaxies holds far less matter than the space inside a galaxy, so darkness becomes the default background rather than an event that arrives. With so little material to scatter or reflect light, the eye is given fewer anchors, and the sense of depth becomes more like a feeling than a measurement, even in that thinned-out environment. Empty never becomes absolute. Diffuse gas still exists, and a faint background radiation still fills the space, yet both are difficult to grasp with ordinary sight, because they do not present themselves as bright points. The scene stays calm because nothing is trying to prove itself. Presence can remain subtle and still be real. Structure reveals itself through contrast, and contrast here is made from scarcity. Voids help outline the larger architecture of the universe because the sparse regions define the boundaries of the dense ones, the way silence can frame a melody without needing to sing. What you notice is not a single object, but a relationship, a pattern hinted at by what is missing as much as by what is present. The paradox settles into an intuitive truth. With less to look at, the underlying frame can feel easier to sense because the mind is not distracted by constant detail. In a wide darkness, small lights become markers rather than noise, and the imagination can relax into the scale without trying to control it. A question rises naturally, then stays open, floating without demand. When almost nothing is visible, what continues to shape the trajectories of everything that moves? Influence does not need brightness, and guidance does not always announce itself in the visible spectrum. Let the islands of light remain distant and let the dark around them stay spacious. Nothing needs to come closer. Nothing needs to be named. The calm is carried by the sense that the universe still has order, even when it is quiet. In that wide background, a different kind of order begins to appear. Not a shining pattern, but a connected one, faintly implied, as if the darkness itself is threaded. Within the broad void, a network-like structure gradually becomes perceptible, not bright, yet unmistakably linked. Thin lines begin to suggest themselves in the darkness, not as bright threads, but as faint corridors that the eye almost misses. Scattered points of light sit along these hints like distant beads, while most of the connection stays submerged in black, giving the impression of a skeleton made from absence. A calm kind of structure appears, quiet enough to not demand attention, yet coherent enough to steady the mind. Field notes settle into place without haste. On the largest scales, matter does not spread evenly, and instead it gathers into clusters and filaments, leaving wide gaps between them. Those gaps do not feel like mistakes in the scene. They feel like spaces that allow the pattern to breathe, as if the universe prefers networks over uniform blankets. Heat can hide in places that barely show themselves. Hot, diffuse gas along the filaments may emit only a weak signal, subtle enough that ordinary sight would slide past it without noticing. Different ways of observing can reveal those traces more clearly, turning what looked like pure darkness into a suggestion of flow and presence. Galaxies resemble bright nodes in this picture, small islands of light anchored in a much larger framework. Between those nodes, the connecting regions can remain darker even while carrying significant material, so the visible points are not the whole structure, only the highlights. The mind often follows highlights by default, yet the frame is built from what stays quiet. That is where the paradox becomes soothing. The part that shapes the overall form can be the part that draws the least attention, because importance does not always announce itself with brightness. In a calm system, support can be invisible, and invisibility can still be decisive. A question opens gently, like a page turning without sound. Have you been treating clear visibility as the same thing as what actually holds the frame in your own stories? A scene can look complete while the true structure remains faint, and noticing that difference can loosen the urge to force certainty. Let the filaments remain barely there in your imagination, and let the nodes of light stay sparse and steady. No need to trace every thread. No need to prove the entire network. A quiet outline is enough to feel that the darkness has shape. As the web becomes easier to sense, another layer begins to press softly from behind it. Something deeper waits under the visible highlights. Not shining, not speaking, yet shaping the way everything gathers and stays together. With the network now implied, a darker influence stands further back, silent and steady, drawing the entire pattern into its frame. a deeper influence begins to feel present behind the web, not as an object you can point to, but as a steady pull that keeps the pattern from dissolving. Curved orbits suggest a hand you never see, and even passing light can seem slightly displaced, as if the path is being guided by something that refuses to glow. Reality check arrives here in a calm tone because calm can hold difficult ideas without turning them into alarms. Dark matter is inferred from motion. Galaxies rotate in ways that visible mass alone cannot fully explain, with stars moving fast enough that the system would seem less stable if only the luminous matter were doing the holding. A quiet conclusion follows from that mismatch. Something unseen contributes gravity, shaping the dance without entering the spotlight. Gravitational lensing offers another kind of hint. Mass can bend the path of light, curving what would have been straight lines into gentle arcs, even when the mass itself produces no light to announce its presence. In that bending, darkness takes on a new role, not as a lack, but as a silent sculptor of trajectories. Large-scale models of the universe also fit more smoothly when an invisible component is included. Structures form, cluster, and persist in ways that align better with observations when a substantial, hard-to-see gravitational ingredient is part of the equation. The pattern you sensed in the cosmic web gains stability when something unlit is allowed to carry weight. The paradox settles with an almost comforting honesty. Silence can be what keeps order, while brightness merely decorates the surface of the story. Light may show you highlights, yet the frame can be held by what never shines, never speaks, and never tries to be noticed. A question opens inward without pressure, like a soft current turning your attention. In your own life, what influences the direction most strongly while making the least noise? A quiet force can guide choices, habits, and returns long before it becomes something you can name. Let the invisible hand remain invisible in your imagination, and let the curved paths be enough. No need to pin the force to an image. No need to force a face onto it. A gentle awareness of influence can be more restful than a demand for certainty. From that silent pull, the drift continues into an earlier time. Starlight begins to feel less central, as if you are moving toward an era before the first bright points turned on. Carried by an unseen gravity, you travel toward a younger universe where darkness was not a gap between lights, but the original background. Darkness returns here as something older than fear, older than longing, older even than the habit of looking for stars. Velvet-like and deep, it spreads as a foundation rather than a curtain, and within it you can sense a far-off warmth, a faint echo that does not demand attention. Paradox opens softly. The earliest night is not the absence of light after light, but the background that existed before light had begun to puncture it. After the universe cooled, a gentle afterglow remained as background radiation, while familiar sources of light had not yet arrived. No starlight was present to form constellations, no bright points to organize the mind into distance and direction, and still the scene was not truly empty. A quiet remnant of heat persisted, subtle and steady, like a memory held in the fabric of space. Before the first stars formed, matter gathered in silence. Gravity worked without spectacle, drawing material into denser regions over a long, dark interval, shaping structure gradually and patiently. Nothing needed to be visible for the accumulation to be real, because the work was happening in the slow language of attraction. When the earliest lights finally turned on, darkness did not vanish. Small, bright regions appeared like scattered embers, tiny openings in a vast background that remained much larger than any new glow. Light arrived as punctuation, not as erasure, and the night stayed wide enough to hold both the sparks and the quiet between them. The paradox settles into something calming. Darkness is not the enemy of light. It is the ground that gives light shape, contrast, and meaning, the context that allows a glow to be recognized as a glow. Without the wide dark, brightness would lose its edge and its tenderness. A final question opens with a gentle inward tilt, and it does not need a reply. If darkness is the background, what within you has been acting as a quiet force, waiting for a small spark to reveal its name? Influence can exist long before language finds it, and growth can continue long before it becomes visible. Let the scene remain velvety and still. A faint warmth at an immense distance, a slow gathering of matter, and the first lights appearing as small points rather than a takeover. Nothing needs to resolve tonight, because the calm lives in continuity, not in closure. And within that deep background, you can simply remain at rest, as if you are part of a slow motion that keeps going, quietly. Without needing to be watched, rest can remain exactly as it is because nothing in the Dark Ages needed a dramatic change to keep moving. What continues can continue quietly, and you do not have to follow it with effort for it to remain real. From that deep background, the next layer arrives as hush, not as a reveal, a baseline that asks for stillness rather than attention. Field notes begin where the eye stops insisting on a picture. The darkness feels velvety, not empty, with a barely there grain that suggests texture the way quiet fabric suggests texture in a cold room. Instead of searching for a focal point, attention can rest on the sense that the background itself has weight, even if it has no sharp edges. A thin scientific thread can sit here without turning into a lesson. The cosmic microwave background still exists as a pervasive field, carried in wavelengths your eyes do not register. Expansion has stretched that field into longer wavelengths over time, easing it into something that can be imagined more like a baseline warmth than like visible brightness. Even this can remain gentle, a presence that does not ask to be looked at because it was never meant to become a picture for ordinary sight. What you call dark changes when you treat perception as part of the scene. Shadow here is not cast by an object. It is formed by a limit, the edge where human vision stops translating what is present. A signal can pass through the universe and still leave you with no image, and the absence of an image does not reduce the reality of the signal. The dark side, in this sense, is the side of the spectrum that exists beyond your window, close enough to be part of the world, yet outside the way your eyes make meaning. The grain in the hush begins to matter, not as noise, but as subtle structure. Tiny variations exist in that background field, small enough to feel like a soft modeling rather than a pattern meant to be decoded. These differences do not interrupt calm, yet they hint that the early universe was never perfectly uniform, and perfect uniformity would have left nothing to gather. A quiet implication follows. The faintest unevenness can become the earliest invitation for matter to collect, long before anything announces itself. A paradox rests naturally in that idea. A baseline can exist without brightening the scene because a baseline is not a spotlight and does not compete for attention. Presence does not need visibility to be stable, and stability does not need to perform to be trustworthy. The hush can hold both darkness and a background field at the same time, and neither needs to defeat the other. Micro progress arrives as texture shifts rather than content spikes. Velvet becomes grain, grain becomes a pressure like stillness, and that stillness begins to feel contoured as though the quiet has gentle slopes you can sense without measuring. The mind does not need a sharp picture to feel orientation. It can be guided by subtle differences in texture, by faint changes in density, by the way a background seems to lean. A curiosity can hover softly with no need to chase it. When visual anchors fade, what allows you to still sense structure, still sense direction, still sense that the universe is not blank? The answer does not have to arrive in words, because the next layer is already preparing itself as a shift from perception to medium. The grain is not only a perceptual effect, and it is not merely noise, it is also where the universe begins to show a different kind of dark side, not the dark side of your senses, but the dark side of the environment itself. Some regions become slightly thicker, some remain slightly thinner, and darkness begins to belong to matter as much as it belongs to seeing. From that soft unevenness, the hush is ready to deepen into an ocean-like medium, where dark becomes a property of what fills space, not only of what your eyes cannot hold. From the hush, the scene does not change by becoming brighter, and it does not need a new focal point to move forward. A baseline that was felt as an invisible field can widen into something with thickness, something that behaves like a medium rather than a mere background. The same calm remains, yet the calm now has depth, as if the quiet has become a vast, cold fog sea. Scale shifts gently because an ocean is not understood by looking for one object at a time. A sea is sensed through continuity, through subtle gradients, through the way some regions feel heavier than others, even when the surface looks uniform. In the early universe, before stars formed widely enough to dominate the scene, neutral hydrogen filled much of space, creating darkness in a simple sense. Not the darkness of absence, but the darkness of a medium that does not glow. A thin scientific thread can rest here without sharpening attention. This era can be traced through radio signatures such as the 21 centimeter line, which is another way of saying the story can be read without relying on ordinary visible light. A different window of observation becomes a different kind of listening, and listening fits the mood of a fog sea far better than staring. Even the idea of evidence stays soft here because the medium does not present itself as a picture, it presents itself as a trace. Unevenness returns not as a flaw, but as a quiet organizer. Density varies across regions, leaving some parts slightly thicker and some slightly thinner, and those differences can be imagined as deep dark and shallow dark, rather than as bright and dim. Structure's shadow appears in these gradients because the architecture of the cosmos can be shaped by where the medium gathers and where it loosens. A sea with no waves can still have depth, and depth can still guide motion. Medium's shadow becomes easier to feel when you stop expecting an object to cast it. Neutral gas can hold information in a subdued way, absorbing, softening, and obscuring certain signals so that the scene remains dark without needing a curtain. Shadow, here, is a property of what fills space, a kind of quiet filtering that makes the universe seem less visible while remaining full. The dark side, in this sense, is the portion of the cosmos that has not been ionized, not lit into transparency, still calm, still carrying mass, still exerting gravitational influence. A paradox can settle as smoothly as a tide. What does not shine can still be what allows the future to form. The way a sea that never glows can still carry currents that shape everything that will later appear at the surface. Darkness becomes protective rather than empty because it provides a stable environment for gradual gathering. Silence becomes functional rather than missing because function does not require display. Micro progress arrives as the ocean begins to feel active without becoming dramatic. A vast fog sea can hold faint currents, slow directional tendencies that do not announce themselves with motion you can watch, yet still shape where material drifts over a long time. Eddies can form as gentle swirls in density, not visible as spirals, but sensed as regions where the medium seems to linger and fold back into itself. Basins begin to suggest themselves as shallow depressions in the cosmic field, places where the fog sea feels slightly more willing to settle. In that settling, the ocean begins to organize, not by flashing signals, but by keeping a slow preference for certain paths. A question can hover lightly like mist holding its shape for a moment. When everything resembles a cold sea of fog, what decides which regions become gathering places and which regions remain wide and open? No answer needs to be spoken aloud because the scene itself is already answering through its gradients, through its thickness, through its patient tendencies. From this ocean-like darkness, the next movement becomes a rhythm rather than a new chapter. Near and far can begin to alternate as sensations. Texture can shift in small ways. Curved motion can return as a steady orbiting feel, and then everything can soften into a fade. The point is not to chase bright points or sudden reveals, because chasing wakes the mind. Tonight follows the rhythm of the dark foundation itself, repeating with variation until attention grows heavy and the universe continues without needing you to track it. The ocean does not end. It simply begins to feel different, as though the same fog sea is changing its rules without changing its surface. No shoreline appears as a line you can point to. A boundary arrives as a shift in texture, a subtle change in how the darkness holds its grain, as if the air itself becomes slightly more willing to keep things close. This is the kind of transition you can sense without proving, because it happens slowly enough to stay calm. A common myth imagines the universe turning on like a switch. Darkness is pictured as something that retreats the moment light arrives, clean and complete, like a room transformed in one instant. Reality moves with less drama and more patience because the medium changes in patches and regions, not everywhere at once, and not in the same way everywhere. Instead of a single moment, there is a long sequence of soft fronts, spreading and overlapping as time drifts forward. Within this fog sea, neutral hydrogen remains a quiet presence. Neutral does not mean empty, and it does not mean passive, because the medium can still shape what passes through it. A signal can be softened, filtered, or partially held back, not by an object casting a shadow, but by the conditions of the gas itself. That is how darkness becomes local, as if one region keeps a different kind of hush than the next, even when both look equally dark. Changes like these rarely announce themselves to ordinary sight. The story is carried more cleanly through other windows, through forms of observation that do not demand a visible picture, because this is not a tale of surfaces and reflections. It is a tale of transmission and absorption, of what travels freely and what is gently delayed, of what slips through and what leaves a faint imprint. Listening fits better than staring, and the calm remains intact when the scene is treated like a medium rather than a display. A slow shift can feel like a coastline made of gradients. Ocean becomes invisible shorelines become wider gradients, and the gradients begin to separate into regions with distinct character. Nothing spikes, nothing snaps, and nothing needs to be explained loudly, because the separation is subtle enough to be felt before it is understood. The fog sea starts to organize itself, not by revealing bright landmarks, but by letting different zones behave slightly differently. Here the paradox settles in gently. The strongest boundary can be the one you cannot see, and the boundary you cannot see can be the one that gives shape to everything else. A frontier without a line can still guide drift, and a shoreline without a horizon can still determine what belongs to which region. In that sense, darkness becomes more structured precisely when it stays visually quiet. A light curiosity can hover without asking you to wake up. When no clear border appears, what allows you to sense that you have crossed into a different region. What tells you the medium has changed, even though the view has not offered you a new object to focus on. Perhaps it is the way the grain tightens, the way the hush feels slightly heavier, the way the fog seems to hold its silence with a different kind of steadiness. The ocean continues, and the invisible shorelines continue with it. The scene remains gentle, yet the background becomes more readable, not because it is brighter, but because it has gained a quiet geography. From these soft frontiers, the next step can be even calmer, a way of tracing structure through absence, through what is softened, what is missing, and what is quietly held back. A very old question rises from the absence itself, as if it has always been resting beneath the fog. If the universe holds so many sources of light, why does the sky still keep its darkness instead of glowing in every direction? The question does not need to become a lesson, because a few gentle hypotheses are enough to make the night feel coherent, and coherence often lets the mind soften. One hypothesis begins with distance without drawing any hard border. Light from places unimaginably far away may simply not have had time to arrive, because the universe has an age, and time sets a quiet limit on every journey. In that view, darkness is not a lack, but a portion of the story that has not reached you yet, a background not yet filled with distant messages. The delay does not feel like postponement. It feels like an ordinary pause built into the scale of things. Another hypothesis follows expansion, and here darkness is not created by having less light, but by light changing as it travels. As space stretches, signals stretch with it, sliding toward wavelengths that ordinary vision does not translate into light. The sky can still carry information while offering no image, because the information has moved into registers that feel calmer, farther, and less visual, like a voice lowered until only its vibration remains. From this angle, darkness becomes the shadow of perception formed at the edge where the senses stop turning presence into pictures. A third idea places dust in the role of a veil, and the idea makes intuitive sense. Dust can soften, dim, and obscure, creating regions where the background seems to follow its own quiet rules. Yet a single curtain cannot explain the whole night, because what is held back does not vanish, and energy does not disappear simply because the eye cannot hold it. If too much were blocked, the background would respond in other ways over time, which turns darkness into a story of balance rather than a story of sealed silence. A deeper hypothesis lives near the invisible shorelines you have been sensing. Instead of one sharp boundary, the universe can change through slow transitional zones where conditions shift gradually and unevenly across regions. In such zones, shadow does not need an object to cast it, because the medium itself can filter, soften, and reshape what passes through. Crossing into a new region can be felt without a line. Simply because the grain tightens, the stillness grows denser, and the hush holds differently. What makes this restful is that these hypotheses do not have to compete. They can stack like thin layers, each one explaining a different facet of darkness, like distance, like expansion, like veiling, like a medium that quietly decides what becomes legible. When darkness has more than one gentle reason, it becomes less like a threat and more like a stable foundation, something the universe maintains rather than something it suffers. A soft paradox sits inside that foundation. The sky is not dark because the universe lacks stories, but because many stories are written in forms that do not appear as vivid images. Meaning can arrive through absence as easily as through spectacle, and a quiet background can give shape to what would otherwise blur. In that way, darkness does not oppose significance. It creates room for significance to take form. A final question can hover without pulling you into effort. If part of reality exists beyond the window of what you can see, what within you might also be real in that same way, present and influential, without needing a name yet? The night does not ask you to answer because noticing is enough. From here, the next step becomes a gentler kind of reading. A map can emerge from what is softened, from what is missing, from the traces the medium keeps rather than the images it displays. And that kind of map prepares the mind for rhythm. Soon the movement can settle into repetition. Near and far, subtle texture shifts, a slow curve that holds, and a gradual fade that makes sleep feel inevitable. A deeper quiet arrives without a hard cut, and the darkness takes on a velvety texture, as if the background has grown softer rather than heavier. Far-off lights remain, yet they feel more like dust than like landmarks, and the space between them widens into a calm that does not need to be filled. Instead of asking for direction, the scene offers steadiness, and steadiness can be more persuasive than novelty when sleep is the goal. In this layer of night, the universe feels less like a collection of objects and more like a continuous medium. Diffuse gas still exists, and faint background radiation still lingers as a quiet afterglow of the cosmos. Though neither announces itself, in a way ordinary sight can easily hold. The absence of obvious anchors becomes a kind of comfort, because comfort often begins when the mind stops scanning for immediate edges. A different kind of connection becomes noticeable here, not as a bright line, but as the sense of bridges you cannot quite see. Between distant galaxies, structure can still be suggested by relationships, by how islands of light seem to belong to a larger arrangement even when the threads remain submerged. Large-scale patterns, the kind that shape where things gather and where gaps remain, do not need to shine to be real, and that quiet truth can settle like a blanket. Micro-progress arrives as a small change in the way you imagine distance. Earlier, far may have felt like a stretch. Now, far begins to feel like a cushion, a wide buffer that softens everything it holds. The mind can rest inside that buffer, because the universe is not asking you to reach across it, only to float within it. Another safe marker can appear without turning the tone into a lesson. On the largest scales, matter gathers unevenly, creating a contrast between dense regions and wide voids, and that contrast is what makes the architecture readable even when much of it stays dark. A single gentle inference follows. Emptiness at this scale can function as structure because gaps help define the shape of what remains. Attention can drift without losing coherence because coherence is already built into the scene. A thought might form, then soften, then dissolve, and the dissolving does not feel like failure because nothing here requires completion. Curiosity stays present, yet it becomes quieter because quiet curiosity does not chase. It simply notices and lets the noticing pass. Now the darkness deepens in a way that feels more internal than external. Instead of imagining travel forward, you might sense a slow descent into stillness, as if the background itself is becoming more supportive and less descriptive. A faint question can hover, barely louder than silence. What holds the pattern when the visible almost disappears? The answer does not need to arrive because the next microstep is already forming as a shift in texture. A suggestion of filaments begins to return, not as lines to trace, but as a soft sense of linkage, like stitch marks you feel through fabric rather than see on the surface. Within that subdued network, the universe remains connected, and you remain unhurried, carried forward by a calm that continues even when attention grows drowsy. A deeper quiet arrives without a hard cut, and the darkness takes on a velvety texture, as if the background has grown softer rather than heavier. Far-off lights remain, yet they feel more like dust than like landmarks, and the space between them widens into a calm that does not need to be filled. Instead of asking for direction, the scene offers steadiness, and steadiness can be more persuasive than novelty when sleep is the goal. In this layer of night, the universe feels less like a collection of objects and more like a continuous medium. Diffuse gas still exists, and faint background radiation still lingers as a quiet afterglow of the cosmos, though neither announces itself in a way ordinary sight can easily hold. The absence of obvious anchors becomes a kind of comfort, because comfort often begins when the mind stops scanning for immediate edges. A different kind of connection becomes noticeable here, not as a bright line, but as the sense of bridges you cannot quite see. Between distant galaxies, Structure can still be suggested by relationships, by how islands of light seem to belong to a larger arrangement even when the threads remain submerged. Large-scale patterns, the kind that shape where things gather and where gaps remain, do not need to shine to be real, and that quiet truth can settle like a blanket. Micro-progress arrives as a small change in the way you imagine distance. Earlier, far may have felt like a stretch. Now, far begins to feel like a cushion, a wide buffer that softens everything it holds. The mind can rest inside that buffer, because the universe is not asking you to reach across it, only to float within it. Another safe marker can appear without turning the tone into a lesson. On the largest scales, matter gathers unevenly, creating a contrast between dense regions and wide voids, and that contrast is what makes the architecture readable, even when much of it stays dark. A single gentle inference follows. Emptiness, at this scale, can function as structure because gaps help define the shape of what remains. Attention can drift without losing coherence because coherence is already built into the scene. A thought might form, then soften, then dissolve, and the dissolving does not feel like failure because nothing here requires completion. Curiosity stays present, yet it becomes quieter because quiet curiosity does not chase. It simply notices and lets the noticing pass. Now the darkness deepens in a way that feels more internal than external. Instead of imagining travel forward, you might sense a slow descent into stillness, as if the background itself is becoming more supportive and less descriptive. A faint question can hover, barely louder than silence. What holds the pattern when the visible almost disappears? The answer does not need to arrive because the next micro step is already forming as a shift in texture. A suggestion of filaments begins to return, not as lines to trace, but as a soft sense of linkage, like stitch marks you feel through fabric rather than see on the surface. Within that subdued network, the universe remains connected, and you remain unhurried, carried forward by a calm that continues even when attention grows drowsy. A slow curve begins to dominate the scene, and the universe feels less like open drift and more like a gentle orbit that continues without being watched. Instead of expanding outward in every direction, attention starts to move in a rounded way, as if the dark itself is guiding motion into arcs. Scale remains vast, yet the sensation becomes steadier because a curve can feel like a promise of continuity. In space, gravity is the quiet reason curves appear at all. Trajectories bend not because anything is trying to turn them, but because mass shapes the path, and a straight line becomes less natural than an arc. On cosmic scales, that shaping does not need to be visible to be present, because its signature is written into motion, into the way systems hold together over time. A thin scientific thread can sit here safely. Where mass gathers, paths curve, and the curve is often the first visible hint of an unseen structure. Islands of light begin to feel like markers along a slow track. A galaxy can be imagined as a node within a larger arrangement, and nodes together imply a network, even when the connecting regions remain dim. Between those nodes, diffuse matter can be present in forms that do not shine in ordinary light, yet still contribute to the gravitational environment that guides large-scale flow. The universe does not need bright lines to maintain coherence. It can maintain it through placement, spacing, and gentle influence. Micro progress arrives as the orbit becomes more personal in sensation without becoming psychological in tone. Earlier, distance acted like a wide background. Now, distance starts to feel like a track you can follow without choosing it. A curve has direction without urgency, and that combination often calms the mind because it suggests movement with no deadline. Even the idea of time becomes softer here because cycles imply return, and return implies that nothing has to be forced. A faint layer of cosmic history can pass through without turning into a lecture. Large structures form and persist more easily when invisible mass is allowed to carry gravitational weight, and that is one reason dark matter remains part of the story of cosmic order. Lensing and rotation are quiet clues in that story, but the calm point is simpler. The universe can be guided by what it does not light up. A gentle paradox follows. The most reliable forces rarely announce themselves with brightness. The orbiting field deepens, as if the background itself is turning. Stars and galaxies remain distant, yet their distribution begins to suggest a slow rhythm, a pattern of gathers and gaps, clusters and voids. Nothing needs to be counted, and nothing needs to be traced, because the rhythm can be sensed without precision. Curiosity can hover as a soft question. When motion is shaped by what you cannot see, what else might be shaping you in quiet ways? Ahead, the curve continues, not tightening, not accelerating, simply persisting. The darkness stays wide and the few lights remain steady, and the sense of orbit becomes a cradle rather than a constraint. From that steady turning, the scene begins to soften again, preparing for the next cycle where edges fade and the background becomes even more velvety. The curve keeps turning with a patience that never asks you to keep up. No sharp boundary appears to end the motion, and no bright sign appears to demand attention, because the orbit does not need an audience to remain true. What continues can continue quietly, and quiet continuation is one of the safest rhythms the mind can borrow. A few distant lights remain in their places like slow punctuation, marking that the universe still has structure without insisting on detail. Between those points, the dark holds everything with an even pressure, neither pulling nor pushing, simply allowing space to be wide. Diffuse matter stays present in its thinnest forms, and unseen mass can still shape trajectories. So order can exist without being loud, and guidance can exist without being visible. The sense of return becomes softer than the sense of arrival. A cycle implies that nothing has to be finished tonight, because the motion will come around again without forcing it. Curiosity does not need to chase, because the scene is already complete enough to hold you, complete enough to let you rest. As the turning continues, edges begin to lose their sharpness. The few bright points do not disappear, they simply grow gentler, as if distance is smoothing them into dust. The background deepens into a darker velvet, and the orbit becomes less like a path and more like a lull, steady and unhurried. Soon, even the idea of the curve can fade into feeling. A slow rhythm remains, a quiet coherence remains, and the rest can be left to the dark that never rushes. If sleep arrives now, it can arrive without a finish line. The way the universe keeps moving without announcing each step. And in that wide, steady turning, you can let yourself be carried as though you are part of the orbit too, held by a calm that continues even after thought has gone still.